July 4th, 1863, but history takes a different turn. At Gettysburg, Lee's artillery finds its mark. Pickett's charge succeeds. The Union line shatters. What follows is not the America you know, but a fractured continent where slavery endures, where two hostile nations glare at each other across a fortified border, where the 20th century unfolds in darkness. This is not speculation. This is forensic alternate history based on military doctrine, economic realities, and the brutal logic of power. Because in our timeline, 620,000 Americans died to answer one question: can a nation founded on liberty survive when built on bondage? In this timeline, the answer is no. The Confederate States of America wins its independence in 1864, and the world that emerges from that victory is almost unrecognizable. The ripple effects will reshape global politics, delay technological progress by decades, and create a North American powder keg that threatens to explode throughout the entire 20th century. Welcome to the dark timeline. Welcome to Confederate America. To understand how the Confederacy could have won, we must return to July 1863. In our timeline, the Battle of Gettysburg was the high water mark of the Confederacy, the moment when Lee's invasion of the North failed catastrophically. But what if just a few variables shifted? Imagine Confederate Artillery Commander Colonel Alexander receives better intelligence about Union positions. His bombardment on July 3rd isn't aimed at empty ground, but strikes directly at the Union center. Pickett's 12,500 men charge across that deadly mile. But this time, they're supported by Stuart's cavalry arriving from the rear, creating chaos in Union supply lines. General Meade's coordination collapses. The Union line breaks at Cemetery Ridge. Lee doesn't retreat to Virginia. He captures Harrisburg, threatens Philadelphia, and suddenly Washington itself is in panic. In the North, war weariness reaches a critical mass. The 1864 election approaches, and Lincoln faces not just political opposition, but a nation exhausted by 3 years of carnage. When Sherman fails to take Atlanta in this timeline, when Grant stalls at Petersburg, the peace Democrats surge. Lincoln loses to George McClellan, who runs on a platform of ending the war on Confederate terms. February 1865. You are standing in a Baltimore hotel ballroom, watching history fracture. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens and Union Secretary of State William Seward sign the Treaty of Baltimore. The Confederate States of America gains formal recognition. The border is drawn along a line roughly following the Mason-Dixon, extending west through Kentucky, Missouri, and Indian Territory. The United States retains everything north of this line, plus California and Oregon. But here's the poison pill. The treaty includes a fugitive slave provision requiring the United States to return escaped slaves who crossed the border. Imagine that betrayal. The Underground Railroad doesn't lead to freedom anymore. It leads to a militarized border where freedom is just yards away, but impossibly distant. The Confederacy claims 11 states plus Kentucky and Missouri in this timeline, approximately 9 million people, nearly 4 million of them enslaved. The economy is agricultural, cotton-dependent, and desperately seeking international recognition. Richmond becomes a capital, in fact, not just aspiration. Jefferson Davis's government must now prove that a nation built on slavery can actually function. Spoiler alert, it cannot, not for long. By 1870, the Confederate States faces an existential crisis disguised as victory. The slave economy that seemed so profitable before the war reveals its fatal flaw. It cannot industrialize. Why build factories when your labor force is enslaved and your capital is literally invested in human beings? Why educate the population when literacy for slaves is illegal and poor whites are kept deliberately ignorant to maintain social hierarchy? The Confederacy's GDP per capita stagnates while the Union's explodes. Northern industry, freed from Southern political obstruction, embraces transcontinental railroads, steel production, and immigrant labor. By 1880, the economic gap is staggering. The Union's economy is 3 times larger than the Confederacy's, Confederate currency is worthless internationally. Britain and France, despite initial sympathy, refuse full diplomatic relations because cotton is now sourced from Egypt and India. The Confederacy becomes a pariah state. But here's the horror. Rather than reforming, the Confederate government doubles down. Slavery expands into Kentucky, Missouri, even New Mexico territory. The slave codes become more brutal, not less. Internal passports. Slave patrols become a national military force. White supremacy isn't just ideology. It's constitutional law. The border becomes the most dangerous frontier in North America. Imagine a demilitarized zone stretching from the Atlantic to the Kansas plains, fortified, patrolled, lethal. The Confederacy builds a network of border forts to prevent slave escapes. The Union, pressured by abolitionist groups who never accepted the Treaty of Baltimore, creates sanctuary zones where escaped slaves are hidden despite treaty obligations. Armed conflicts erupt constantly. Confederate slave catchers cross the border illegally, sparking firefights with Union militias. In 1872, the Richmond incident nearly reignites the war. Confederate forces pursue escaped slaves into Pennsylvania, killing 3 Union citizens. President Grant mobilizes troops. War seems inevitable until European powers mediate a stand-down. Both nations are now armed camps. The Confederacy maintains a standing army of 100,000, draining its treasury. The Union builds coastal fortifications aimed at Richmond and Charleston. Every border town is a potential flashpoint. The Underground Railroad adapts. Now it's a paramilitary operation using coded telegraphs, safe houses, and armed conductors. Harriet Tubman doesn't retire. She becomes a general in the Shadow War. By 1880, an estimated 50,000 slaves have escaped to the Union, and nearly 2,000 people have died in border violence. By 1885, the Confederate experiment is failing catastrophically. Slave rebellions increase in frequency and violence. The Nat Turner Rebellion was one man in 1831. In this timeline, the 1884 Virginia uprising involves thousands of armed slaves who seize Richmond for 3 days before being massacred. The Confederate government responds with genocidal violence. Public executions become routine. The reign of terror alienates even Confederate sympathizers abroad. Meanwhile, the economy implodes. Cotton prices collapse as global supply increases. The Confederacy has no industrial base to transition into manufacturing. Unemployment among poor whites skyrockets, creating political instability. Here's where it gets darker. Confederate leaders propose expansion. If the domestic economy is failing, seize new territory. Plans are drawn to invade Cuba, Nicaragua, even northern Mexico, creating new slave states. In 1886, a Confederate filibuster expedition attempts to seize Veracruz. It fails disastrously, and Mexico allies with the United States. The Confederacy is now surrounded. Internally, political factions war for control. Hardline slavery expansionists versus pragmatists who whisper about gradual emancipation. President Davis's successor faces an impossible choice: reform the system and admit defeat, or maintain slavery and watch the nation crumble. Violence is chosen. The existence of the Confederacy warps global history in profound ways. Without a unified America, European powers remain dominant longer. Germany's Bismarck watches the American division with satisfaction. A fractured North America cannot challenge European colonialism. The British Empire breathes easier without American competition in the Pacific. Most critically, imagine World War I in this timeline. It begins in 1914, as in our history. But the United States, bordered by a hostile slave nation to its south, cannot intervene in Europe. President Wilson's attempts to join the Allies are blocked by Confederate threats to invade Maryland if Union forces deploy overseas. The Great War drags on until 1920, killing not 17 million, but perhaps 25 million. European civilization is bled white. Russia's revolution succeeds more completely without American intervention in 1918. The balance of power tilts toward authoritarian regimes. Meanwhile, the Confederacy faces a new crisis. The Great Migration never happens as in our timeline, because there's nowhere for Black Americans to migrate within the South. Instead, a desperate exodus floods the Union, creating refugee camps along the border. The Union struggles to absorb millions of traumatized refugees. Racial tensions in Union cities explode. The promised land isn't as promised as it seemed. No system this unjust can last forever. By 1920, the Confederacy is an anachronistic horror in the modern world. International pressure intensifies. The League of Nations, formed in this timeline but without American participation, condemns slavery. Economic sanctions devastate Confederate trade. Internally, everything is breaking down. The Confederate Army is riddled with desertions. White working-class resentment of the plantation aristocracy reaches revolutionary levels. And then, 1924, the Great Slave Uprising. Coordinated across 7 states, utilizing smuggled weapons from Union abolitionists, 2 million enslaved people rebel simultaneously. The Confederate government orders total war on its own population. What follows is genocide. International observers compare it to the Armenian massacres. The Union can no longer stand aside. President Coolidge, under enormous public pressure, declares war on the Confederacy in August 1924. The Second American Civil War is not fought between equal powers. It's a rout. Union industrial might, modern weaponry, and air power overwhelm Confederate forces within 8 months. Richmond falls in April 1925. Jefferson Davis III surrenders unconditionally. The Confederate States of America is dissolved. Slavery is abolished by military decree. But Reconstruction in this timeline faces challenges that make the actual Reconstruction look simple. 60 years of institutionalized apartheid, generations of trauma, and a white Southern population that views defeat as apocalypse. The reunification of America in 1925 comes at a staggering cost. In our timeline, America emerged from World War I as a global superpower. In this timeline, America is broken, reuniting after 60 years of separation, economically devastated by war, and facing the mammoth task of integrating a traumatized population of 8 million formerly enslaved people and their descendants. The cultural impact is profound. There is no Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. There's a refugee crisis. There is no Jazz Age spreading from New Orleans. That culture was suppressed for 2 generations. African American leaders like W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey exist, but in this timeline, they're militant revolutionaries, not intellectuals seeking accommodation. The Great Depression hits a reunified America even harder than our timeline. Economic recovery takes until the 1950s. By the time World War II begins in 1939, America is not the arsenal of democracy. It's a rebuilding nation barely able to defend itself. Hitler's Germany and Imperial Japan face no American opposition until the late 1940s. The atomic bomb is developed in Germany first, in 1947. The world that emerges is darker, more authoritarian, with fascism triumphant across Europe and Asia. America, when it finally recovers, is no longer exceptional. It's a cautionary tale. So what does this dark timeline teach us? That our actual history, as brutal and unjust as it often was, represented the better path. That the Union victory in 1865, costly as it was, prevented something far worse. That Lincoln's assassination was a tragedy, but not as catastrophic as Confederate victory would have been. In our timeline, America abolished slavery, and despite the failures of Reconstruction and the horrors of Jim Crow, eventually moved toward equality. Progress was agonizingly slow, often violent and incomplete, but it happened. In this alternate timeline, slavery continued for 60 more years. Millions more lived and died in bondage. Global history shifted toward authoritarianism. The American experiment in democracy nearly died. When we look at our actual history, we should see not just what was, but what could have been. The Confederate monuments that dot our landscape aren't just historical markers, they're warnings. Warnings of what happens when we romanticize rebellion against justice, when we treat slavery as a side issue rather than the central moral catastrophe of our history. The dark timeline didn't happen, but it could have. That possibility lives in every choice we make about how we remember our past and shape our future. Remember, 620,000 Americans died to prevent this timeline. We owe them the truth. And we owe ourselves the vigilance to ensure history's darkest possibilities remain safely in the realm of alternate history.